again on behalf of the conveners of the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance to this book launch and of John Dryzek's and Ana Tanasoca's new book. It is entitled Democratizing Global Justice, Deliberating Global Goals, and has recently been published with Cambridge University Press. I think this is a very timely book, which proposes a normative theory about democratizing global justice and also applies this theory to two specific cases. It is the Sustainable Development Goals and climate governance. My name is Dannica Fleuß. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Group, and I will chair and moderate this event. I'm taking over this moderation from Sonja Busse, who put a lot of work in putting this event together, but unfortunately cannot join today for personal reasons. Nevertheless, we're very much looking forward to launching this book and to exciting discussions with all participants. Subsequently to a brief introduction to the book, its core arguments and themes, we are very excited that Eva Erman agreed to be the discussant and to challenge and confront John's and Anna's account. And after that, the floor will be open to the audience, and we're very much looking forward to lively discussions with all participants for sure. Before I hand over to the authors, I would briefly like to introduce and welcome all of today's speakers. First of all, John Dryzek, who probably in this field doesn't need much introduction. Nevertheless, John is a centenary professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra and has been one of the instigators of the deliberative turn in democratic theory. His current work particularly focuses on issues of global justice, governance in the Anthropocene, and responses to crisis phenomena, to democratic crisis phenomena. Ana Tanasoca is a research fellow in philosophy at Macquarie University, and she works in the area of normative political theory with a particular focus on international ethics and democratic theory. And Eva Erman, who kindly agreed to be the discussant for today, is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. She works in the field of political philosophy and is particularly interested in democratic theory, critical theory, and meta-ethics. John, Anna, at this point, I will, without further ado, hand over to you and ask you to give us your account of the book's main themes and arguments. And after 10 to 15 minutes, Eva will pose questions to you and engage in a discussion. John, Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you, Dannica. So we're just going to say a few things about the book. Obviously, we can't go into all the details and all the chapters. So more generally, ours is a book about the relationship between justice and democracy, and specifically between global justice and global democracy. And we used the process that led to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 as our main case study. So we argue that global justice needs global democratization that is inclusive, global deliberative decision-making for several reasons. First, because of the reasonable moral disagreement that exists among stakeholders. So different conceptions of justice can each be defensible in their own right, yet since their prescriptions might clash, we need a mechanism by which we can solve those conflicts. Second, principles of justice operate at some level of abstraction, generality. They are thus underspecified and so not immediately action guiding on the ground. So this means they require further specification, meaning we must determine what they practically require in any given social, economic, political, and cultural setting that might, of course, impose some feasibility constraints on what can be done to advance global justice. So it is not enough to just know who bears the duty of justice, and notice that most scholarly discussions have focused on this question. We must also determine the actual content of that duty of justice, how the agents should discharge it, and what that duty calls for in practice. So the first step in discharging those duties of global justice is basically the exercise of what we call formative agency. And of course, a natural question that arises is who should exercise this formative agency and how? So the concept of formative agency is the main theoretical contribution of the book, if you will. And we call formative agency the moral work involved in the specification of general principles of justice. So each time we reflect upon and determine how abstract moral principles should be implemented on the ground, we can be said to exercise formative agency. So we argue that formative agency, with regard to the specification and implementation of global justice in particular, is better exercised through inclusive global deliberative processes, which can enable the participation of both duty bearers and recipients of justice. And we argue that this sort of processes are more likely to lead the exercise of formative agency to the actual implementation of global justice. And I think I'm just going to let John further elaborate on these questions.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. What I'm going to do is actually just zip through the categories of agents that we talk about. As Anna suggested, the idea of formative agency is conceptually central to the book. And that's the way we organize the chapters, by different categories of formative agents. As Anna also said, our main case is the process which yielded the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which on closer inspection, despite their name, are really all about global justice. They featured wider and deeper public consultation than ever before in any global governance process, and arguably some of the more deliberative aspects of global governance ever seen, but still full of shortcomings from our perspective as well. And so we develop ideas about how it's possible to do better in such cases. When it comes to the SDGs, some conceptions of justice fared well. For example, neoliberal commitments to economic growth and marketization. A Rawlsian concern for the least advantaged appeared in some of the goals. A feminist conception of justice appeared in Goal 5, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. A conception of justice associated with Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum on capabilities, which emphasized capabilities, was very strongly there. But others fared less well, particularly conceptions of justice which are ecological, intergenerational. Surprisingly, human rights don't get much of a mention, and a strong cosmopolitan view of justice, which downplays the obligations and responsibilities and the claims of states in favor of treating individuals as their units of concern and obligation, fared poorly. The radical discourses, the voice of the sort associated, for example, with the World Social Forum, and the voices of the poor themselves didn't make it through into the final negotiations which yielded the goals. So let me just go very quickly through some of the particular categories of agents that we analyze. And I mean, the short story is that all of them are problematic, but in different ways. So when it comes to the formal authority of states and international organizations in Chapter 3, states and international organizations dominate global governance, unsurprisingly. But they are problematic formative agents. States in particular have material priorities, don't necessarily coincide with justice. They're also adept at bending the language of justice to serve self-interest and cloaking self-interest in the language of justice. International organizations can sometimes do that too, and often find it difficult to escape the priorities of the states which set them up. Think of the World Trade Organization, which reinforces the economic imperatives of states. So we suggest improving the deliberative character of the engagements of states and international organizations, but also the need to embed them in larger deliberative systems with other categories of agents who are less constrained in their ability to advance different conceptions of justice. Chapter 4 is on those with money, the rich, corporations, foundations. The rich can have substantial impact, not just in terms of their influence on policy, but also in terms of their choices when it comes to how to give if they decide to make charitable donations, for example. We argue that even if they do choose to give with the intention of ameliorating injustice in the world, that can establish political relationships of hierarchy and domination in relation to the recipients of their largesse, and those relationships need democratizing. Corporations, for their part, are hardwired for profit, and we need to curb any formative role they might play in the global system. They have no legitimate role in the system when it comes to formative agency. Foundations, similar to the rich, can establish relationships of domination and hierarchy in their operation. So Gates Foundation, for example, gives out $4 billion a year, plays a massive role, bigger than most governments in areas like, well, bigger than most governments and international organizations in areas like health and agriculture. It's accountable to nobody. It takes a high-tech approach to things like genetic technology. It often imposes solutions on the recipients of its largesse. And again, we argue that kind of relationship needs to be democratized in deliberative terms. Experts and public intellectuals, for their part, offer partial perspectives on justice, and they disagree with each other. So, for example, on the Sustainable Development Goals, we have some public intellectuals and experts broadly supportive of the goals. Jeffrey Sachs would be a prominent one, and he's the leading figure in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. The public intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein were very critical of the way the goals developed, especially for their very mild approach to inequalities. Bjorn Lomborg, from the opposite, almost opposite perspective, suggested that we need to subject the goals to cost-benefit analysis, and we find that many of them just don't stack up. Anyway, there is a need there to deliberate across these different conceptions of justice offered by experts and public intellectuals. Lay knowledge matters also there. The situated knowledge of lay actors, especially those on the receiving end of injustice. And so we need to figure out ways of incorporating them into deliberation with public intellectuals and experts. Advocacy groups, such as Oxfam, for example, should not substitute for the agency of the poor themselves. They're obviously often very powerful on the world scene. And there's a need to, well, not just have them deliberate with each other and engage in advocacy, which they already do. But it's also important to democratize their representation claims. And here we draw on the work of people like Michael Sayward and Laura Montanaro, who have talked about the need to validate those representation claims, so that so that advocacy groups don't substitute for the claims of the poor themselves. Okay, just moving on very quickly. The chapter 6 is on empowering the many, citizens and the poor. Citizens are elusive in practice on the global stage. They do have, as we know from work on many publics, they do have the virtue of independent judgment and reflective capacity, which can otherwise be in short supply. When it comes to global governance, global elections are unavailable, so it's hard to see citizens being incorporated that way. But we can think of other ways. In the Sustainable Development Goals, we see some well-meaning, pioneering, but haphazard and only loosely coordinated processes with little quality control, which intended to incorporate the voice of ordinary citizens in the formation of the goals. But in the end, there was very little coordination, and there was very little integration of that kind of citizen engagement with the more consequential deliberative processes and the negotiations that eventually yielded the goals. So there was no discernible impact of all this citizen this citizen consultation on the Open Working Group, which was the key institution that finalized the content of the goals and was made up of representatives of states. There were representatives of advocacy groups in the room too, although they were not formally part of the negotiation. We suggest that global mini-publics would help us do better. But the point there, well, as I would argue with mini-publics in general, is that they should be seen as inciting more effective, broad-scale public deliberative participation in global governance and not substitute for that kind of participation. The poor, for their part, again, there was an effort made out to reach out to the poor in the Sustainable Development Goals process. But the main attempt was global, but not the main attempt was global, but not very deliberative. Key here was the My World survey, and there was efforts made to reach the poor, especially in developing countries, to have them respond to this survey and try to prioritize what the global goals should be. So it was global, but not very deliberative. And so perhaps the most promising deliberative initiative, which did try to involve the poor directly, was something called the Participate Initiative, which was organized separately from the official process, and involved the creation of what were called ground level panels, which took place and involved the direct participation of the poor in developing countries, with a view to figuring out what their perspective on the goals might be. And often it turned out to be very different from what was appearing in the official negotiations. But it was not very consequential. It had no discernible impact on the negotiations which yielded the goals. So it'd be possible to build up from those kind of ground level initiatives, and also think about this proposal that was made by Scott Weiser in the context of the SDGs. Think about a deliberative global citizens assembly with targeted recruitment of the poor. We might also think about finding a place for the poor in deliberative systems for poor-led transnational social movements. But such movements are much thinner on the ground than our advocacy groups. The example that everyone uses is La Via Campesina, the global peasants movement. Intergenerational, interspecies, and ecological justice were largely missing in the Sustainable Development Goals. Chapter 7 of the book is on how we can think about expanding the moral imagination of participants in deliberative processes to prioritize these three kinds of justice. And then finally, we look at how all these categories of agents might fit together more effectively in deliberative systems. We think, and so we talk about, for example, more effectively integrating different consultation tracks in the context of processes like those which yielded the SDGs. Improved accountability links, which are often pretty much absent in global governance, especially accountability downwards. Accountability horizontally is much more widespread. Better transmission from global civil society to the negotiations. We can think about different forms of representation, new kinds of channels, including the idea of an institutionalized global dissent channel, which is proposed by our colleague Jonathan Pickering. Okay, so that should give that was a very brief tour through the book. Should give a flavor of what it's all about. And I'll just conclude with the slogan: "No global justice without global deliberative democracy." Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. No global justice without global deliberative democracy is a very brief summary on, and I think it's a good point of departure for Eva to challenge the authors maybe a bit, post questions. We discussed in advance that you have 3 core questions and I want to ask them one by one. So thank you very much to the authors for this brilliant presentation account of the book. And Eva, I think the floor is yours now to engage the authors in a discussion about the account. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to read this book. I think it's a fantastic book and extremely rich. And I also thought it was very nice to see, I recognize many of the threads from John's earlier work that I read a lot about representation of discourses, deliberative global citizens assembly, deliberative systems, and so on. And I think here they're brought together with Ana and I guess Ana's previous work in a very nice way. And I think also it works very well with the 2 empirical cases running through the analysis, making the questions addressed not only more concrete and alive, but also I think makes the proposed answers to those questions unfolded better in their complexity. Personally, I'm very sympathetic to this project, and I have for a long time been very passionate about core ideas of deliberative democracy and agency. And I think overall agency, or democratic agency, political agency, is under-theorized in normative democratic theory. So it always feels a bit uncomfortable to try to find problems and raise questions in relation to a book that achieves and covers so much and about such complex matters. Since one can always say that you can't do everything, right? So I wanted to keep this in mind, and I will offer a few reflections. There are so many interesting questions to discuss, not least with regard to the different formative agents that you bring up in the different chapters. And I found those empirically informed analysis of different kinds of agency extremely rewarding to read. Unfortunately, my expertise is very limited when it comes to these more concrete aspects, including when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate governance. So I hope others here today will raise questions about that. I also largely share the conceptual assumptions made of agency, justice, and deliberation. So my reflections here move on a more fundamental and therefore more abstract level. And I think I have three questions that mainly revolve around what kind of contribution you make in the book. So that's what I wanted to hear more about. The first bundle of questions I would like to hear more about is this: what kind of account or theory or theoretical framework, however you like to put it, is offered, and what is its normative status or even empirical status? I think that I see two candidates, and I'm curious to hear more about it, and maybe you want to do both. In the most explicit formulation of the contribution and also in the presentation now, I think it's clear that it's a theory or account of the practical realization or pursuit of global justice through deliberative democracy. And I think many of the discussions and arguments fit well with this aim, not least the deliberative democratic framework, of course. On this reading, the best practical realization of global justice is through deliberative democratic processes in deliberative systems. So deliberative democracy presumably can be justified in many ways, but it's the best means to implement or achieve global justice. And the main justification, I think, is that there are many competing conceptions of justice out there, and there will always be disagreement about which is the most justified. So on this view, it's a kind of normative democratic theory that is proposed, a deliberate approach to global governance, which deals with the realization of justice. So such a view, however, if it's a normative view, presupposes a notion of justice, even if this notion is very general or abstract. And I think this fits with many claims made in the book, like you often write that justice requires this and that. And you write that agents like NGOs, activists might bend the content of justice in questionable directions. I mean, these claims seem to suggest, that they're normative claims and not simply conceptual claims. So you seem to have an account of global justice at your disposal, even if it's at an abstract level. That's one way of understanding it. It's abstract. We need formative agents to interpret these principles in a non-ideal setting. And I think that's a worthwhile goal. A second reading of your contribution is more deeply involved in theorizing justice, not only in realizing or implementing justice, but also in formulating and justifying justice through deliberative processes. So formative agents are not only supposed to contribute to the achievement of justice, but also actually specifying the content and scope of justice and what justice requires. So in this reading, it's not the case that these agents have a few reasonable conceptions of justice at their disposal and try to specify what they mean. It's more like, as far as I can tell, it's all existing views of justice, reasonable and non-reasonable, is up for grabs. Sometimes I read this into the discussion. This means that as long as the formative agents follow the deliberative norms, the outcome of the deliberation would be what justice is. And I think on this view, I also see a methodological contribution in the book, since the deliberative framework offers something similar to the veil of ignorance, or offers support or proof of a conception of justice, telling us at least which conditions must be fulfilled in order to arrive at justice, whatever that is. So I think these both readings are plausible, and I was wondering a little bit if you see the tension between the two, or if you just see pursuing one or the other. And if you look at the first reading, deliberative democracy is the best way to achieve global justice, presupposing some notion of justice. On the second reading, it becomes a more deliberative democratic theory of justice as a view of justice and or methodological, meta-theoretical view of how to arrive at justice. So the question is, if you take the first route, which I suspect you do, what notions of justice are the competing justice that we should take into account as formative agents? Is it any notion of justice, or is this just reasonable notions of justice? And the second view runs the risk of letting the concept of justice be too much of an empty placeholder for whatever idea of good global governance that these formative agents pursue by appealing to rhetoric, storytelling, emotions, and so on that you discuss. So I think the second one runs the risk of turning a normative notion of justice into a sociological one. So I think, in conclusion, I think that the answer to this has to do with how you see the relationship between justice and democracy on a more fundamental level. Yeah, that's my first question. I don't know, you wanted to take them one by one, right?
Okay, Anna, John, so responses, reactions.
John, do you want to start first? I think we might even give different answers to this question. Should I start, or do you want to?
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah? Okay. Yes. So there is definitely a tension. I think Eva is definitely right, and I think we kind of struggled with this tension, because we keep talking about global justice, but then we, as if we must have some conception of what global justice is, but we wanted to avoid that because we can't come up with that because we actually emphasize reasonable moral disagreement and the need for formative agency, right? So if we endorse a certain conception of global justice, then obviously we kind of undermine ourselves, right, and our argument for formative agency. So in what concerns me, I do think that definitely it should be a normative conception. It's not just a sociological one, and I think you're right, there is that danger that this would become like a purely sociological kind of conception, whatever the people, that justice is whatever the people says it is, and I was kind of fighting, we were kind of fighting against that, I guess, in the second chapter where we theorize formative agency, and there, I was thinking that what we want to say is that there is a moral truth about, what global justice requires, but obviously, what it requires in every different context is different, right? Hence, you need the sort of, people who can take the ideal theory and, transfer it to the non-ideal level, right? So there's a fair degree of relativity in that sort of exercise, and we also emphasize that because we take it that there is some moral truth to this question of what global justice requires in every given context. We say that because of the way in which inclusive deliberation increases the epistemic competence of the deliberators, it's more likely, that the result of that deliberation is going to track that moral truth. So, it's kind of like we combine it with an epistemic argument, right? But it's also because of how the different interests, actually reflect in that deliberative process, right? So if you have a deliberative and inclusive and equally participatory deliberative process, right? So you kind of impose those conditions, right? And that's what basically we discuss. We discuss kind of under what conditions you're more likely to kind of get to that moral truth of what global justice requires in any given setting, right? And also, you have different agents, if all the effective parties are actually included in that process, then we think it's more likely for each other's self-interest to kind of cancel one another, and for the kind of the impartial view of justice to emerge right out of that kind of contestation of what justice is, and out of those partial views about what justice means, right? So that's kind of how I see it. I don't know about Jean. So I would say, definitely I'm leaning towards the second interpretation that you offered.
Sorry, can I just clarificatory? Now you mentioned that you want to incorporate or take serious the reasonable disagreement on justice, but I think that's different. You don't say that in the book. You say disagreement on justice, and reasonable disagreement that already
limits.
That already has justice in itself. I mean, like Rawls has as well. Then you have now normative boundary conditions for what notions of justice are just not acceptable. Justice at like some, so I think that
justice as self-interest does like
exactly justice to the strong. So I think by doing that, what you say now, you avoid some of the questions, but that's not really how I read it in the book. It seems more like any notion of justice out there should be brought in and be deliberated, and some will be thrown out, and someone. I mean, it's up to the formative agents, right? Because there are no criteria for that you offer for which conceptions of justice are
I
good enough
think you're
to
right
be
that people tend to pack a lot in that reasonable. When they talk about reasonable disagreement, they pack too much into what reasonable means, and then you avoid the entire problem altogether.
No, I think it solves your problem actually, because then at least you can answer what reasonable is. But without that, it becomes an empirical.
Yes, but then we need to specify what reasonable is.
Yeah. So
and then we can't take it that it's moral vacuum that needs to be specified. Then we're actually doing the specification ourselves, and maybe we're allowed to do, because we're also allowed to act as formative agents of justice ourselves. But I do think there is a puzzle there for sure, and you touch on that. So I would go with the reasonable, and I do think, to kind of clarify, maybe I want to make I do believe that we all have access to that. We must all have access to that conception of what reasonable is, because I think that if we don't, so it's accessible to us, but at the same time it might be up to debate as well. I would say that maybe it's not that debatable, it's not that contested, but I'll let John.
Okay, that's an interesting exchange between Eva and Ana. I think, like Ana, I probably come down. I mean, I can see the two concepts, the two ways of thinking about what we're doing, Eva, that you raise. I can see why there's elements of both can be discerned in the book. But I think that we are involved in helping to theorize justice, and that's where the idea of formative agency comes in. I mean, going back to where does the language of agents of justice come from? I mean, that was originally introduced by Honora O'Neill, and her argument was that any theory of justice is incomplete without an account of the agents upon whom the obligation to justice rests. So what we do is take that one step further, because she assumes that we know what the conception of justice is, and then we just need to specify the agents. What we argue is that we don't necessarily know exactly what conception of justice should be applied in any particular context. So we need agents who will do that. That's what formative agency is. Now, I would see that as an element of the theory of justice. It's not just. It is. So, in other words, we're not simply treating deliberation as something deliberation on the part of agents as something which is instrumental to justice, but it's something which I think is absolutely necessary to thinking about the theory of justice.
I think it's been argued by many, like Valentini and others, that democracy is justified because there will always be disagreement on justice. But for me, as a democratic theorist, I see so many other virtues with democracy that has nothing to do with disagreement about justice. But that, I'm not saying that against the book, because you just said that this is one way of justifying democracy. There might be many other ways, of course. And in this particular context, it's about getting to justice and what global justice means in different contexts.
Actually, can I just the relationship between democracy and justice? I remember it's about 20 years ago now, having a discussion with Iris Young, and she basically criticized me for not caring about justice at all, for only caring about democracy. But what she argued, at least in conversation, was that the only justification for democracy was if it's instrumental to justice. And like you, I don't believe that that's true. I think democracy has its own justifications, but one of which can be justice.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yes, sorry.
I didn't want to interrupt. I just I just wanted to ask you to maybe like also pose the second question to the authors that you prepared. But if you just want to continue with this dynamic debate, that's fine with me as well.
Yeah, we can move. I only have 2 more questions. We can move on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, off the top of my head, this made me thinking about justice and democracy, and I think my own intuition here, and I wanted to hear what we can discuss that after. But I think it could be fruitful to distinguish more fundamental justice and distributive justice. It seems like you're actually talking about distributive justice, and I think that in a sense, if we have this distinction, we have another slogan: no global democracy without deliberative democracy without justice, because you need some comprehensive idea of fundamental justice in order for deliberative democracy to be defensible. And as such, a defensible such theory, regulated and constrained by these more fundamental principles of justice, could then be used to arrive at more applied principles of distributive justice. That could also, because I think that distributive schemes are premised upon fundamental justice. And what I mean by that is that primary goods, rights, duties, liberties, resources, and so on, they're supposed to be that are supposed to be distributed. They just don't fall down on us. They were produced and reproduced through just and unjust schemes of cooperation. So thinking that justice, in a sense, the slogan "no global democracy without justice" works for me if it's about fundamental justice, and perhaps no justice without deliberative democracy works better for distributive justice. That's just thoughts that we can discuss if you've thought of that. Okay, should I move to my second question?
Yeah, I would like, in terms of timing, to also have a bit of time for the audience to raise questions.
Yeah. Okay. So I do the 2. I can take the 2.
Bundle these 2 questions.
Yeah.
And then so it's great that we have such a dynamic discussion. And I didn't want to interrupt it, just in terms of also giving the audience some space. So that would be great.
Yeah. And the second and third, actually, I think they're connected to the first. So I think they can go much quicker. So the second bundle of question connects to the idea of what contribution you make, and that relate to your 2 empirical examples about sustainable development goals and climate governance. So I think it would have been easy for me to grasp their role in the argument if I know more about the answer to the track 1 or 2 in the first. So what role do these cases have for the overall argument? I think on the one hand, they're often used as illustrations to exemplify, but also to refine the usefulness of deliberative theoretical framework. On the other, the concrete goals and aspects of justice in the sustainable development goals and the climate governance also sometimes are discussed as justificatory, playing a role for justifying the proposal about formative agency and deliberative view of global justice. You talk about them as the vehicles of justice, as it were. So are these examples then giving you proof of the rightness of your account or support? Is that then an empirical support, or what is it? So this actually connects to what status these examples have. Because wouldn't it be possible to use the 2 examples for a non-deliberative account of global justice? How can we tell, why the examples give support to your theoretical framework rather than alternative frameworks? And connected to that, I was wondering if you sometimes feel like you offer a deliberative theory of global governance. Isn't that precisely a theory of democratic global governance that you offer, having actually little to do with justice, but which is able to deal with, among other things, questions of global justice, along with questions of freedom, autonomy, political legitimacy, and so on. So that would mean that you actually offer a deliberative theory of democratic global governance that can deal, among other things, with global justice. So maybe it's a more separate issue with justice. So that's my second question. And the third also connects to the 2 other, and it's about agency. And I really liked your analysis of agency and your criticism of O'Neill. An agent, I think plausibly, on this view is someone with the capacity to act in intentional ways and reflect upon the motivations for action. I think this is a very commonsensical and useful notion. And it's argued that deliberative democratic processes can enable formative agency in global governance and empower formative agents of justice. To be a formative agent of justice means to be able to practically influence the scope and content of justice, track 1, and its realization, or track 2 and realization, track 1. So here we have both views. Formative agents are also supposed to do the moral work required to implement abstract principles of justice on the ground. So that's track 1. Here, the both views again. On the first, they in fact decide the content of justice. On the second, they interpret what already existing principles of justice are supposed to entail in concrete situations. Principles that either have some kind of pre-deliberative normative status or are sociological or empirical, that principles that in fact exist, whatever they are. But I wanted to hear more about it's not that, it's about the formative agents of justice and the relationship between agency and formative agents of justice. Formative agents of justice are those that are able to influence the discourse of justice and decide the content and scope of justice. So is this an empirical notion? Or do agents have to fulfill certain normative conditions to become formative agents of justice? If it's an empirical notion, it doesn't itself lend support to your deliberative democratic approach, I think. But sometimes I read it more, you talk about how they should act. So I think you assess them through the deliberative, normative, deliberative lens. But I was wondering what it's at the same time seems like you look for formative agents where they actually are, who can actually influence or are able to influence. So I was wondering, not all agents, if agents are those that can act in intentional ways, presumably not all agents are formative agents of justice. Not all agents that act intentionally are able to influence the content and scope of justice? Or are all agents conceptually already formative agents of justice? And I think why this is important is that, isn't it a question of justice who are supposed to have influence and on what grounds? So I believe both the examples in question 2 that I have about the role of the examples and this question about formative agents have to do with how you see the relationship between the normative and empirical premises of your contribution. And I would like to hear more about that as well.
Thank you very much. John, Anna, reactions to the status of your examples or cases and the notion of formative agents?
How about, Anna, should I deal with, I could deal with the status of the cases if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
And then you'll address.
Go ahead. And
is that okay? And then you can address questions of agency, or would you rather?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't
okay.
matter.
Okay. So I'll address the cases. Okay. So the main case, Sustainable Development Goals. Minor case is climate governance, global climate governance, in as much as it takes on questions of justice. I wouldn't see. I don't see these as merely illustrative. I think they play a more important role than that. They provide a kind of a field for thinking through the theoretical questions, and there are things which come up in the cases which leads us to think about, well, what is possible when it comes to thinking about what agents could be more effective when it comes to determining the content of the content of global justice. So examples there might be, I mentioned ground level panels. They do suggest that effective deliberation on the part of the poor in local context can deal effectively with global level issues such as the SDGs. And so I think that enables us to say things about the possible agency of the poor themselves, which are different. So I'm thinking about, say, the approach to the agency of the disadvantaged in Gutman and Thompson, Democracy and Disagreement. Amy Gutman has just been appointed ambassador to Germany, but that's, but anyway, so Gutman and Thompson take a very social democratic approach, and they suggest that the agency of the poor and disadvantaged could benefit from redistribution. So what they implicitly suggest is redistribution first and then deliberation second. What the ground level panel suggests is that we can have effective deliberation on the part of the poor without having to wait for redistribution. So that's just that's just one example. And then another case at the sort of opposite end of the process, if you like. If you look at I mentioned the open working group, which finalized the content of the goals, there were features of that which were surprisingly deliberative. Normally in international negotiation or multilateral negotiations, it's very much a bargaining process. This, compared to most global governance processes, the Open Working Group did have deliberative features, and we can look at the institutional design aspects which enable those features to come out and learn from them and say things about possible things that might be done to channel the agency, the formative agency of states, and acting through international organizations in more defensible directions. So it's not just illustration. It's, as I say, it's more of a field for thinking through.
But then I think that I think that's how I read it. Also, you can refine your. But how could they be used to change your theory or theoretical framework, or is it more? Because I found those examples, it was more indirectly about feasibility and how we can actually go from can to be able to in a more concrete terms. Or would you say that since they're not only illustrations that they could be used to, because I think they're also used to show that things are happening that can actually fit with our theory or account. And we can also do things to even improve the deliberative quality and the processes and so on. But could they have been used to revise your normative theoretical?
Well, it depends. I think they can revise at the margins, yes. In terms of rethinking the deep commitments, probably not. No. And so you did suggest that, well, other people with different concerns, with non-deliberative approach to justice, could also look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and they have. So it is possible to look at everything through a different kind of lens.
And I was also thinking that formative agency, there are other ways than deliberation to become empowered from being enabled through education, through mentorship. I mean, deliberation is one way of empowering, but presumably other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I would say
for the non-democrat.
I mean, the strong claim would be that, okay, although things like education, for example, that's good, but at some point you still need deliberation.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Anna, with regards to the concept of formative agents, do you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, so I think Eva mentioned, she had several points, about the theoretical argument and the illustrations. I actually think there is a problem in the sense of, we can't easily claim that the examples were that we use, the Sustainable Development Goals process just, to kind of back our theory. I also feel like it's the argument that we make is it's very hard kind of, leverage empirical evidence in support of it, mainly because, we say, deliberative, inclusive, democratic deliberation, makes it more likely that you're going to track the truth about, what global justice requires on the ground. How do you judge that afterwards? If you didn't really have to begin with, a conception of justice, right? How do you measure, the aftermath, right? If you don't have that sort of, right? So, I think there is a problem there, in terms of, how do we actually test, if you were to empirically test, our theory? I think, there is a problem there with the testing. Second, I think you have a question about the democratic global governance and whether, our argument is not one generally for democratic global. Yeah, for sure. It is. It can be, framed as such. It's not just, for global justice. I also feel like formative agency as a concept. It can apply. It's not just formative agency about justice. It can be formative agency about pretty much any moral principle. It can be formative agency about benevolence or altruism. And we actually developed this, in a separate article, right? So, what is formative agency? Well, it refers to those, those capacities involved in specifying these moral principles, right, so that they can apply on the ground. So it can be pretty much any moral principle, it can be, theories of justice or theories of charity, so on and so forth, right? So I think you were right with that. So in terms of, I have to bring a clarification. I think maybe that's also because of talk about, formative agency, right? So in my view, also to talk of agency is just the ability to act in a certain way, right? And here is just the ability to exercise formative agency. To have formative agency means to be able to kind of engage in that sort of moral reasoning, right, about justice, right, and what it requires on the ground. Now,
and
if
able
you
to
do
influence that.
Well,
able to
I mean,
influence
that's the issue. I mean, that is the issue, because I do not think that, I think that you can draw a distinction between the exercise of agency and empowerment, meaning, you actually get to influence the world and achieve what you mean to achieve. So not every action is going to achieve its purpose. Obviously, you can still exercise agency, even if you're not going to achieve your aim, right? So that's kind of, there's a bit of, moral, like a philosophical slippage in that sort of discussion. Obviously, when we use them together, exercise formative agency and influence and impact, the delivery of justice in the real world, we kind of mean that those people that actually impact what justice means on the ground would have already exercised formative agency, right? So, any kind of impact is probably, they would have exercised formative agency before. But that being said, you can exercise formative agency, and I think, that's what we want, right, without necessarily making an impact. Now, if you want to exercise formative agency in a way that's impactful, we think, especially when it comes to the global poor, and especially when it comes to citizens, we feel like it's going to make more of an impact if you exercise formative agency in this sort of way through inclusive deliberative processes, right? So those are two separate points, and I kind of, we have to keep them separate. Although, in our discussion, I do take the point that sometimes, they kind of, they are conflated, right? Sorry, is that did I answer all of your?
I think that sounds right.
Okay, thank you so much for this lively dynamic discussion to all the three of you. I would like to invite the audience in right now. We already have 3 questions in the chat, and everybody who wants to ask questions in person in this digital space is welcome to raise his or her hand. So maybe I'll just start out with reading out something of the questions in the chat to the authors, and then you can respond to that, and over this time maybe somebody else will also raise his or her hand. So one question raised by Raymond addresses the relationship between outcomes and process or deliberative processes. And he is asking, why should we reinvest so much in the process or the procedures of establishing what is just, when some forms of injustice, poverty, other clear forms of suffering, primary bads maybe, are very obvious and are probably more effectively or realistically addressed by non-deliberative activism? So why invest so much in the procedure when there are clear primary bads or injustices? Jensen Sass is asking if the liquidation of inequalities in power, especially that of corporations, is a precondition for realizing any vision of global justice. So would that be a precondition? That's the second question that we have so far. Yeah, maybe just take these 2 questions, and then we will let you give a response and see who else drops in. And we have a 3rd question in the chat that we can take in as well.
Okay. I can take
John, Anna.
I can take the first one.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to offer to, but I'll let you do it, and I might chip in as well.
Okay, so just very briefly, so why favor deliberative democracy, right? Well, I actually think it's not that obvious. So first, you have some feasibility constraints, right? You don't have enough resources, so you always have to decide, towards what what claims, to kind of whose people's claims you should satisfy first, where you should divert resources, which sort of causes should come first, and so on and so forth. Second, there is some uncertainty involved, even if not about the ends, you can say, okay, we agree morally about what the ends of global justice are. You still have uncertainty about the means, how is what's the best way to achieve them. And I think, that uncertainty matters because, you can't really make decisions for these people. And I'm talking here about the global poor, right? Saying, yeah, I know for sure, we're going to go with that. There are always some risks. And when you make decisions, you impose that risk on these people, right? So I do think there is something morally problematic about that. Obviously this, the well-known, paternalist objection in the sense that you're thwarting other people's agency, and they should, insofar as their interests are so heavily affected by your decisions, they should have a say in those interests, right? So I do think that those are basically, the main reasons why. I do think that there is like a third, epistemic reasons. The more people are involved in this sort of decision making, they bring in, situated knowledge. They have a better view of what they actually need on the ground and what's the best way to achieve it. So I don't think, you can say from your ivory tower, I know for sure that that's what you need, right? Again, I think these are actually hard decisions, and I do not think activists, who kind of with their badge of honor, yeah, I'm doing my thing, this sort of, it's not, I think it's morally problematic in all sorts of ways, and epistemically as well. So I'll just stop there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Actually, that's I think that's a better answer than I could have given to that one. So I'll move to Jensen Sass's question about sorry, was that the second? The second one was Jensen's, right? Is the liquidation of inequalities in power, especially that of corporations, foundations, billionaires, a precondition of realizing any vision of global justice? Is that Dannica? Is that what we're moving to now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. In the book, we don't use the language of liquidation or elimination of inequalities in power. What we do, though, is we do stress the inequalities that currently exist, but I think eliminating those inequalities is a very distant goal. I think the way I would see it is that we can ameliorate those inequalities in as much as they are unjustifiable inequalities in the exercise of formative agency. So if we're talking about, say, I don't know, something like the Gates Foundation, for example, the Gates Foundation currently has enormous impact on the lives of many people in developing countries, but they have no say in the activities of the Gates Foundation, and that's an enormous inequality. Now we can think about ways of ameliorating that. Maybe formalizing processes of citizen deliberation on the ground in recipient localities. We could even think about the ways of getting Gates Foundation leaders to meet with advocacy groups such as La Via Campesina, who have a very different view of what should be what's desirable on the ground. We can talk about innovations like that in terms of ameliorating inequalities and moving us to a more defensible situation in the terms that the theoretical terms that we establish in the book. But in terms of liquidating inequalities and making the Gates Foundation leadership purely equal with the recipients of its aid, I think that's a very distant utopian goal, and we don't have to wait for something like that before we can think about ways of improving things.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have one further question in the chat, and so this question is by, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Raphael Drashevsky. And it's also concerned with the preconditions. I was wondering if you would like to ask this question just yourself. It's a fairly long question, and otherwise I will just read it out. So would you like to ask the question?
I think, I can, summarize it. And this is definitely, one of the points we struggle with. So, what can we actually do about authoritarian states, who might not, allow these, deliberative democratic processes to occur within their borders, or they don't care about being accountable to their citizenry. So is it that they are disadvantaged by our account, right? And we actually discussed this in chapter 6, and this is a real problem, and this is also one of the reasons why we put so much emphasis on the need for a global assembly, right? And a global assembly that can be actually promoted at the level of the United Nations, right? So to put it very bluntly, we didn't say that in the book, but it's a good idea to bypass states as much as we can, right? And to enable these deliberative democratic processes to kind of happen at the level of these institutions, in order to avoid such situations. Also, because if you keep them at the level of the state as they were, right, because each state could actually organize its, deliberative consultation, then, you end up with a situation where, the global poor do not exercise, equal formative agency in global governance, right? They don't get the chance. It just matters. It's up to the state and its democratic capacity and how accountable it is to its citizenry. So this is one of the reasons why we emphasize why it's so important for the United Nations to actually get more independence maybe from states. And this is a tricky issue, and this is something we haven't. I kind of regret maybe we didn't discuss this in the book. I was told, how many people we interviewed. But this is an intergovernmental organization, right? This is an organization, these UN actors can't get, these UN agencies can't get too much independence from the states, right? They can't do their own thing. And I guess, what we would want these global institutions to be actually more powerful, but also to kind of have more independence from states, right? To be able to we want this global democracy to actually grow within these institutions, right? Precisely because these deliberative democratic process cannot be supported within the states, right? But also, for the additional reason that we truly believe that we have to have a transnational, a global conversation, right? And we also believe that states can never actually speak on behalf of the global poor. And we actually have a proper discussion in the book in chapter 6, why they will never be, able to do that. So yeah, it's definitely a problem, but this is why we need these global institutions to kind of amp up their democratic game, democratize more, gain more democratic legitimacy, and involve global citizens more in their processes.
Yeah, just as just one observation on Raphael's question. Authoritarian states don't necessarily restrict their citizens from participating in global processes to the same degree that they restrict their citizens participating in the processes of the state. So there's even the possibility of a bit more freedom there in terms of the exercise of formative agency on the part of the citizenry in global governance compared to state governance.
Okay, thank you very much. So to all participants in the audience, so are there further questions to the authors or also to Eva? If you want to raise them in person, you can raise your hand with a button under the participants list. I think we still have some time and resources left to answer questions from the audience, if there are any. Raymond is raising his hand. Please.
Yeah, but I don't want to kind of occupy the floor when there are other people. I already asked questions. Maybe Michael first.
Okay, so you may ask a follow-up question, but Michael is also raising his hand. So maybe you want to go first. You didn't post the question in the chat so far.
Okay, thank you, Dannica. Congratulations, John and Dana. Really looking forward to get my hands on the book. A really specific question on the notion of formative agency, just to clarify that a little. I think it sounds fascinating and really useful. From what I've understood, and I've not seen any of the books, so the answer may well be there on page 42. You seem to stress in your comments formative agency as, if you ask what is formative of, what is it forming, this formative agency, it appears to be in one way or another, and you've had a long conversation with Eva about this, a conception of justice, to bring into focus a situated conception of justice, depending on the focus of the topic involved or the challenge involved. My question is, does it also, the notion of formative agency, also include the idea of forming that agency itself, that agency coming into being, as it were, as agency, which could mean things like, for example, agents, individual or collective, kind of becoming aware of the force of their agency, the possibility of their agency, capacities for their agency, or something like that. So my query is simply to clarify a little, did you intend sort of both sides of that coin? And if you could fill out what sounds like a really interesting concept a little more along those lines. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, actually that's interesting. I must say, in terms of your second use of the word formative, I don't think it occurred to me in terms of.
We have something slightly similar.
Sorry, Anna?
We have something slightly similar when we talk about the global community of interest.
Right.
But not, yeah.
Actually, that's right. Yes, yes. Do you want to elaborate?
So again, this is not exactly what you were pointing at, but so we do talk about the global poor and the fact that obviously we political theorists refer to the global poor as one kind of moral claimant, right? And obviously in the UN refers to them as well. There's reference to the global poor and so on and so forth. But obviously, so supposedly we do say that the global rich have a duty of justice towards the global poor. And we do say that global poor should actually exercise, formative agency in global governance collectively, as a collective agent. The problem is that, they are not actually constituted and cannot act as a collective agent, right? And we actually say, in the book that it's important for them, to organize these global deliberative processes so they can actually constitute themselves as a moral claimant and act together, So I guess that's the closest to what you were saying. We said it's important for them to kind of perceive themselves, to develop this collective, identity, these we intentions, and to form this global community of interest, right? To defend their interests, in global governance, right? So it's important for them. This is why I said that when you said that the global poor need to exercise global, formative agency, we do refer to them as a collective agent, and we say that now they can't really act as such, but that's why it's important for them to be involved in democratic deliberation and to be able to develop that sort of identity and that sort of capacity. So it's not exactly maybe what you pointed at, but similar.
Do you want to add this, Anna, John, or you?
Sorry.
So far, and we proceed. Do you want to add something to Anna's answer to this question?
No, I'm nothing. I think Anna answered it very well.
Okay, great. So we have further questions. Anastasia and Raymond raised his hand again. So maybe to up on first stage.
Yes, hello, and thank you for this interesting presentation. Congratulations on that. I just have a question on a more kind of empirical level. So I see the potential of theorizing global justice through these procedures and the importance of deliberation. I just wonder how this approach can really be, if integrated or can be challenged from the existing structure that we have in international law and international organizations. So what we have in place already, or what's the level of interaction, or this kind of a new approach that can bring to what we have already? Because whether we have it or not, justice also implies relations I have with legislation and formal structures. So how these two levels interplay, and where do you see perhaps the main challenges in applying such an approach, which I think is very important in how we democratize global justice? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Raymond just said he's emailing you questions later on, so maybe you just want to address the question.
Yeah.
John.
Okay. Yeah, I can address that. So in terms of, well, obviously what we're doing is we are proposing a normative theory of global governance, and in terms of how it can better promote justice. But we think it has numerous practical applications, and in fact, there are so many that I hardly know where to start. At the end of each chapter of the book, we summarize a set of prescriptions which we believe follows from our analysis, and so there's there are all kinds of reform possibilities that start with global governance as it exists now. So in other words, we're not what we're not doing is just presenting a sort of a full-fledged model of global democracy as an alternative to the status quo. What we have is a normative theory which gives us all kinds of points of leverage in different aspects of the status quo, and that ranges from the role of social movements to how we might think of better deliberation in peak level multilateral negotiations, to the various channels that might connect them. So all I can say is read the book. There's loads in there on exactly that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Dina Zayed asked a long question in the chat. Dina, do you want to come to the front, or should I read it out?
Okay.
It's an either-or question, which is bad in this forum. So, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry about that. It was a follow-up, I think, to a point that Ana made about an earlier question on how to engage with authoritarian states. And I think I sort of need to caveat this a little bit, that I work on authoritarianism, so I always find it a little bit difficult to sort of see how we tend to talk about deliberation within authoritarian contexts as using the language of a problem. And so I think it was directly to the point that Ana was raising of, bypassing the authoritarian state, or sort of bypassing this context and trying to offer democratic legitimacy to global institutions. So I was wondering if, what the risk of that is. So are we potentially reproducing dynamics of these empty stakeholder workshops that tend to be contextless in framing and depoliticized? And I was saying that from a practice perspective, as someone who has worked in the space, I have seen countless examples of deliberative work that's facilitated by international agencies, but that simply ignores this political structure in a room. It ignores the elephant in the room, and thereby it's actually reproducing structures of autocratic power. So I think I was just a little bit struck by that comment, and I wanted to hear a little bit more, of course, with the disclaimer that I haven't read the book. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so in all fairness, that was just my personal kind of view. It's not really, we don't take such a strong view in the book. But so, the issue is, with the process, and I guess, we were thinking mainly about the Sustainable Development Goals and, how those negotiations went. There isn't enough. The goals were obviously, tweaked, and although there was, a democratic demand maybe for stronger goals and for a certain, phrasing obviously the states intervene and they vetoed certain, sentences, certain kind of framing, certain words, especially words like, democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. And this is, first is bad. Second, obviously it's going to be up to the states to implement them. But, I was thinking in terms of these consultations, right? So, they organized consultations, and these consultations were mainly organized by the states. It was left to the states to organize them. And unfortunately, because of that, there were so many global poor that were not actually consulted, right? Their inputs didn't actually go into this process. So in my view, these organizations, if they can bypass the state in that situation, that particular situation, that's fine. Now, I do take it that you have a point that we shouldn't ignore the elephant in the room, and we should actually have some strategies for improving the quality of government in these states, right? Putting pressure on these states to open up or democratize. That is actually very hard to do, as we know. Right? Democratic transitions do not happen overnight. They are reversible, and so there are good questions. I do think you can do both at the same time. I think sometimes it's good to bypass states, and it's a calculation. Is this one of those situations where we can do and we should do that? On the other hand, you should continue to put pressure and to kind of sticks and carrots, because at the end of the day it might be up to that, to kind of for these states to actually change and for the government to improve. But at the same time, maybe one way of improving the quality of their government is helping the grassroots in those states, right? Giving more power to the citizens there, right? Improving their quality of life, improving, the way they make decisions. And maybe, you're going to have some, kind of bottom-up pressure in those countries, right? So what does this amount to? Encouraging, revolutions, encouraging kind of, transition, regime change? Yes, that's what it amounts to. But I do think it requires kind of a diversified, kind of strategy, right? Sometimes you have to bypass them. Sometimes, you shouldn't, and you should kind of engage with them. And sometimes it's very important to actually not neglect them and engage with them directly, obviously.
Okay, thank you so much. For this answer and for the lively discussion. We're already a couple of minutes over time, I believe. Nevertheless, I didn't want to just close. Is there anything on behalf of the authors that you would like to add? I have like a bunch of questions in my head right now about the relationship between substance and procedure, and about the transition of authoritarian regimes and so on. But I think that's probably for everyone involved here, that your book is just so rich that it opens up so much space for discussion that we could have a very, very long, way longer session. But are there any concluding statements by the authors or the discussant that you would like to get rid of? John, Anna.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a closing statement. I mean, this has been a great discussion, and so lots to think about based on it. And yeah, just thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks in particular to Eva for her very thoughtful comments.
Yeah, so thank you,
Thanks.
Eva, for your questions. Were very good, and indeed, it's not a perfect book. I think you kind of, highlighted that quite well. We tried our best. So hopefully, there's, enough valuable in it for people to read it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks to all speakers. Thanks to all participants on behalf of the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for these exciting conversations. I really genuinely believe that there's so much in this book that we could have a way longer discussion about very exciting questions. Thanks to all of you. It was a lively debate, and I think we all value that as political theorists, researchers in this field. And yeah, thanks to John and Anna and Eva in particular for being available for this launch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay.